Well, our first topic for today, my friend, is toxic workplaces and where
Mm.
they come from and how you fix them. And this is not going to be the first conversation that some of our listeners have been a party to of late about toxic workplaces, because as you've probably heard over the summer and into the fall, Ellen DeGeneres maybe isn't as nice as she pretends to be. I don't know. I mean, I don't know her personally. I'm not trying to call her out. She could be a lovely person through and through,
Hmm.
but there's been this kind of national pop culture conversation about the work environment of her show. Have you heard about this?
I've heard headlines, but honest to goodness, that's what I get nowadays. I just get headlines. So explain to me the more specifics, if you could, as to what constituted this toxic work environment at the DeGeneres show.
So the first thing that came out was some folks who had been guests and who had were themselves like TV stars and whatnot, making
Okay.
comments like, "Hey, this is an act. This person isn't as sweet and nice as you think she is." And then
Oh.
more kinds of comments like that trickled out, and then it moved into the workplace thing, where people who had worked at the show and on the show and no longer do
Mm.
had complained that there were some pretty awful things happening there in terms of the way that they were treated, and that it was tied to the kind of environment that she either created or allowed. And I
Mm.
think the dialogue since, in defense of her, again, because not knowing the whole story, only hearing what you get reported, um, she has taken responsibility for that. She has acknowledged that there were things happening she was not aware of, and has pledged to fix them. And I think that for the first time that I can remember, the turn of phrase "toxic workplace" has been showing up in our collectiveness.
Mm.
You know, you flip on your Good Morning America and your Today Show, and you flip through your magazines and your favorite websites, and there's a lot of stuff being published on toxic workplaces. And as someone who does a lot of leadership development work and a lot of staff development work, this is a turn of phrase that I'm quite familiar with.
So when you hear it, when you experience it with clients, what is it? What are some of the specifics that they recognize as
Mm,
elements of a toxic workplace?
yeah. Well, I get calls all the time from folks who say, "Hey, can you work with us? You know, can you do a retreat? Can you do some staff development work with us? Or, we have a culture here where
Mm.
people are miserable, they're unhappy, they act out, they take their stress and strain out on each other. We can't keep good people," right? These are all signs and symptoms
Mm.
that there's a problem. When you have folks who are predominantly looking out for themselves above the interests of the customer, above the interests of the organization. If there's no sense of shared purpose, there's no sense of, well, yeah, maybe I could leave this job and go work someplace else and make a little bit more, but boy, I would lose all these other things that I really like and value, right? Um, the term toxic workplace is so generic,
Hmm.
right? And that actually is part of the first conversation that needs to happen if you think you have a toxic workplace and you want to try to fix it, is getting clear about the exact nature of the problem. What are the behaviors and the experiences that are problematic? We have to work to identify where those are coming from, what happens when they occur, or what doesn't happen when they occur,
Mm.
and then work to identify why such incidents are tolerated or ignored.
When you're talking about these illustrations about this misery that is part of the culture, right? People taking stress out on each other, self-interest over the collective commitment to the organization or to the team. I think back to my time leading teams in the corporate realm. And while I may have 1,000 of those incidents in my head,
Mm-hmm.
right, I can tell you without a doubt that while I may not know every single behavior that contributes to a toxic workplace. I absolutely do know when I feel it.
Yeah.
I know when I feel that I am either, it's not an either statement. I know when I am a part of a toxic workplace.
Yes. And having been a part of one, is that so? That's what we're saying. You have had that experience.
Absolutely. And I was going to qualify my statement there to say, I know when I have either experienced or been a part of. But as a leader, if you are experiencing a toxic workplace, then you are a part of that toxic
Yeah.
workplace. So I cannot say with utter certainty looking back. In fact, my body would absolutely tell me, no, you didn't
Mm-hmm.
act in accordance with trying to do all that you could to reduce the toxicity.
Yeah.
But at least now I can kind of reconcile in my brain. I did what I knew how at the time.
You bring up such a great point about the struggle that I think a lot of bosses face when they're working in an environment that is difficult for people. As a result, I mean, there's so many reasons it could be difficult. It could be one or two bad actors. It could be a legacy, a culture that has been able to perpetuate over time that has really grown to become the way we do things around here. But you bring up this great point that a lot of leaders can be in a toxic environment and not see themselves as part of the problem because they're spending so much time fighting like hell to protect their people from what's happening. And that's what great bosses do. Great bosses stand in front of their team and say, I'm going to act as a barrier. I'm going to be a shield between the crap that rolls downhill
Yeah.
and you. And I'm going to try to divert that and shield you from it as much as I can so that you can focus on what you're there to do and not have to take all of that home with you every day.
Yep.
And it's such a challenge because for so many bosses listening to this, it is not their job to fix that toxic workplace. They don't have the power. They don't have the authority. The risk to them is too great. The correcting, repairing a toxic workplace is the responsibility of senior leadership and to work downhill from there. At the same time, though, there are a lot of bosses who end up becoming a part of the problem because they stay silent.
Yep.
And silence condones some of the problematic behavior that shows itself in a toxic workplace.
And that's the inner turmoil, the toxicity that exists in each of our leaders that are trying to effectuate change, that are trying to struggle with that on a minute-to-minute basis to say, okay, I'm that funnel of information, right? I'm trying to strain out all this crap and still fight against it and still do this, but then also be authentic and lead from my values and all of these things. And
yes,
where do I exist in that? And I don't have all of the answers because, frankly, my conflict, my toxicity landed me in the hospital. And what I have since learned from that experience, though, is that if you can't stop to at least acknowledge it, that's where the real potential of hurt and damage to yourself happens.
Well, and that's just the point, isn't it? I mean, we're going to eventually do an episode where we spend a little bit of time on your story, Alyssa, which is pretty compelling, and learn a little bit more about that journey that you went on, that experience that you've had. But when you, as a boss, have to try to exist in an environment where you are trying to put yourself between the drama and the harm and your people, it is a recipe for accelerated burnout, right?
Yeah.
It is a fast track to some really scary mental and physical health consequences.
Yeah. Being able to have that level of self-awareness, to be able to say, this is what's this is what's happening. This is the reality of it.
Mm-hmm.
And acknowledging, and it might not be part of the, your role to acknowledge it in a more public arena, but
Right.
at least acknowledge it for yourself. This is what is going on. I It does not align with who I am. Here's what I can control.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I cannot control about this situation. And the ability to at least raise that level of awareness for yourself, I think there's a real element of powerful introspection, and that is where you can start to orient yourself from, right?
Absolutely. And I think then the next step is at least acknowledging it to your people, right? At one level, that's an act of empathy. If there's a lot of crap that folks are dealing with, if there are some circumstances, some people who are creating a toxic work environment, acknowledging that is going to at least not make you appear as a phony, right? If you don't acknowledge it, failure to acknowledge it in and of itself will reduce your credibility and in turn reduce your effectiveness. You will not be able to recharge them, help them with resilience, support them in the limited ways that you can as a boss if your credibility is shot. And that's such a fine line to walk too, because there is a cost to saying, yeah, I know this place is a mess right now, right? You're throwing other people under the bus, and that's a problem too. But if we want to have a bit of a more macro conversation about toxic workplaces and what we need to do if we're in one,
Yeah.
and this is going to go right to your sweet spot, I think more than anything, a team or organization needs to define its values. It needs to define clearly what they want their culture to be and the acts that have no place there. And then they have to craft and enforce a clear ironclad plan for what happens when a violation of those values occurs. And if we truly want to repair an organization, there can be no exceptions and no variance in the rules for members of the organization, because let's be honest, there's often a power dynamic at play, right? Often those higher up on the org chart get away with more.
Mm-hmm.
The harder someone is to replace, or the more revenue they bring in, or grant money, or the more sales they have, the easier it is to say, well, let's give this person a second chance, or a third. Or we say, well, that's just the way he is or she is, and we have to work around them. And you will never overcome that.
Yeah. What I hear you saying is that the antidote to toxic workplaces begins by this accountability to values, right?
Yes.
And being able to help raise that level of awareness for ourselves as leaders, within ourselves, and then also within the organization as well.
And noticing that if an organization doesn't have values, or the values of the organization will never result in the kind of change or progress that is necessary to be a safer, healthier workplace, then you got to go. I mean, you can stay and suffer, but you're just continuing in an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
But if we want, and even beyond the values thing, though, and this is where I go from the macro to the micro, right?
Okay.
So we have to do the work around values and getting clear on that, and that has to be from top down, and the most highest ranking folks need to be full-throated in support of that and driving that. But parallel to these efforts is that employees at all levels have to receive training on how to do things like give feedback and manage conflict and speak up when they see or experience problematic behavior. And direct supervisors have to be given training on how to build trust and create safe workplaces where communication and vulnerability are not just encouraged, but necessary.
Yeah.
And we must also acknowledge this. In many places, those direct supervisors who were in charge while toxic behavior occurred they're going to struggle with this. In a sense, there is a hole they can't dig themselves out of. Saying, oh, I know this is how things were before, but it's going to be different now. Trust me. Be vulnerable with me. I'll make things safe and I'll protect you. That's a really hard sell. In many cases, it is much more effective. And I have advised organizations of this. It is much more effective. The runway to success is shorter if we start over with new leaders sometimes who don't have a history or a track record with the employees. Because the mountain they have to climb to earn trust and open the lines of communication isn't as high as it would be for supervisors who were there while the problems occurred.
Wow. I can't think of a more brave space to be in than to be that leader that says, this place can't change unless I leave it. And being willing to sacrifice at that level to say it's more important than my title, than, whatever it might be, to have this organization, this group of people be able to have a new level of commitment, a new level of trust. And even though you may have worked really tirelessly to eliminate toxicity in the workplace, you are still the example of it. At some point, maybe that's true, that you have to then say, okay, what is the ultimate sacrifice here? What is for the greater good?
I'm a big hockey fan.
Okay.
I live in Pittsburgh, home of your 5-time Stanley Cup champion Pittsburgh Penguins. And there is a sort of accepted norm in the professional hockey world that the shelf life of a coach, a professional head coach of a hockey team, really isn't very long. It is not uncommon to see hockey teams, even championship hockey teams, replace their head coach every 3-4 years.
Huh.
There are other sports where we have coaches who have been, Mike Tomlin, the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, he's been there 17, 18 years now. But hockey is different, and what they have figured out is that in that environment, there needs to be a constant turnover of the voice. And they talk about this a lot, that when people hear the same things over and over again, the same voice over and over again, they start to tune it out, they start to get used to it. And so just because a hockey coach gets fired, there is a general acknowledgement that doesn't mean he failed. That doesn't mean that they're a bad coach. It's just that their time had run its course with that particular group of people. And so it's not at all uncommon to see a head coach in hockey get hired immediately elsewhere because now they're the new voice for a new group of people. And so I think some of what you said, Alyssa, which is just so smart and so spot on, is that because I was thinking about it from the angle of the organization who has to sometimes look at a manager and say, listen, the well is poisoned here. And so we gotta move you along to have any hope of making things better, both for them and for you. But what you're saying is, what if the leader raises their hand and says, I've done all I can here. There is no more forward momentum, no more progress, no recovery on the horizon until another voice comes in through the door. I love it.
I thank you for the sports metaphor and understanding. I had no understanding that that's what went on in hockey. So again, you weave in this beautiful puck.
That was a good try. I'm not sure it works, but that was a good try.
Okay. Well, I'm not a sports person. Sports person.
I want to say one more thing about this before we put a bow on it, and it's related to the first thing that we started with. I said that I get calls a lot from organizations who say we're having these problems, we have this toxicity. My second book is called No More Team Drama, Ending the Gossip, Clicks, and Other Crap That Damage Workplace Teams. So I get calls a lot from organizations who say, yeah, we have some team drama,
yes.
And we have some work to do. And the truth is that there is one question I ask above all others in those conversations, and it's very early in the conversation, and it's this question. Is there one person on your team, or maybe two, who, if they left today and never came back, most of these problems would be solved?
Mm.
And do you know that the answer is always yes? It's always yes.
Yeah.
And that is why I have come to tell audiences when I keynote, when I do training workshops, sometimes the single biggest, most influential action you can take to address a problematic work environment is to remove that one or two people who are driving it all. I use the analogy in a lot of my writing and training of pulling the weeds, right? Weeds do one thing in a garden. They strangle the life out of the garden. There's no transforming a dandelion to a begonia. They're a weed, and they've shown you over and over again they're a weed, and no amount of nurturing and patience and transplanting is going to transform that into from what it is to what you hope it will be. And the number of times I have had people call me after training, after keynotes, and say, we pulled a weed. And oh my goodness, what a difference. I wish we had done it sooner.
Wow.
To me, that's actually one of the shortest paths to addressing toxicity in the workplace, especially if it's not an organization-wide problem. If it's limited to a particular team or business unit, oftentimes it's being driven by one or two bad actors who have been able to get away with things, who have decided that an abrasive approach is what works for them. They have to go if we want to recover.
That makes complete and utter sense. And gardening, I get. Hockey, not so much. But I got the weeds. I get that. Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad we can mix up metaphors here, both ones that speak to you and others that are less familiar.